I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Grant Newsham, a corporate and governmental advisor and lecturer on Asia-Pacific defense matters and business risks posed by organized crime, money laundering, and political instability. Grant currently serves as a senior research fellow at the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies and has prior experience in risk management for Morgan Stanley Japan, security management at Motorola Japan, and U.S. Foreign Service work in Washington, D.C. and Tokyo. Grant retired at the rank of colonel in 2014, following a 30-year career of service in the United States Marine Corps Reserve, and holds a Juris Doctorate from UCLA. Grant, welcome back, and I want to start out by thanking you for your career of service. I also want to get into talking about Russia's war in Ukraine, which is something that you have written articles on recently. That's actually what connected me with you, and you had some really poignant thoughts, I guess, that I think are worth sharing with people. So let me start out by asking what your thoughts and opinions are on the recent escalation of hostilities in the Ukraine war.
I think the Ukrainians would say they've been pretty escalated for a long time now. But I think what we're talking about is the Biden administration's decision to allow these missiles that are called ATACMS to hit targets inside Russia. And the idea is, well, this is going to escalate the war. It's going to provoke the Russians into doing even more than they're doing now. And then, nobody quite knows, but you can look at this and say, look, this administration has 60 days to go. Why didn't they do this sooner? Why is it now? Why are they doing something that they know is just going to infuriate Putin when they start doing it, even though militarily the ATACMS used against Russian targets don't make much difference? It'd be as if in 1917 on the Western Front in World War I, if the British and the French had introduced some new big cannons, and say a lot of them, and used them, well, this would knock things around on the other side pretty well, more than it had been, but there's just so much fighting going on that these new cannons aren't going to make any difference. It's going to take some other way to end this war. And so back to this question of why did the administration do it? I don't know. They haven't said. And it would be useful if you are going to do something, as I said, that you know is going to provoke Putin, to explain why you've done it. And the excuses, the reasons, the justifications that you seem to hear most is, well, it gives the Ukrainians a better bargaining position in any future negotiations to end the war. That's the one you hear a lot. And then the other one is, well, it's going to make sure that Donald Trump, the president-elect, cannot just cut off the Ukrainians and sort of let them die. Those are the excuses you hear most. And I don't know that any of them's all that compelling. And I don't know which is it. If I had to guess, I would say it's the first one is the real reason. This idea, well, we've got to give these brave Ukrainians as much as we can, while we can. And the latter one, which would seem to be awfully churlish, I wouldn't rule that out, unfortunately. There is a sense that, well, this Trump, he's friends with Putin. He's just going to cut a deal and Ukraine's going to go under in a second. That's just not true. But tell yourself a story often enough and you kind of convince yourself of it. But the point of it is that these weapons being introduced to be used in this way, it's not going to change the fundamentals of the battlefield in Ukraine. And one thing that is important to note, I think, particularly if you've been following this war since the beginning, is that in all combat, timing matters. And sometimes you can do one thing that is incredibly effective, and then you can do the same thing at another time, and it's of no use at all. And what I'm getting at here is about 8 or 9 months into the war in Ukraine. You remember the Ukrainians had the Russians on the run. They were discombobulated. Remember, even the head of Wagner Group, his guys were doing much of the fighting. Remember, he launched a coup and headed up to Moscow. And that's how bad it was for the Russians. If at that point you could have introduced these weapons that really allow you to really reach out at least 200 miles and hit exactly what you're aiming for, if you could have combined that with the other things the Ukrainians were doing that had the Russians sort of moving backwards fast, it might have been successful. And that window closed. The administration refused to do it, refused to even supply these missiles, the ATACMs, much less allow them to be used against anybody. And to say the window was open and then it closed. And then, if you may remember, the next thing was, well, the Ukrainians are husbanding their forces. There's going to be this spring offensive. It's going to bust through the Russian lines. Well, what had happened in the meantime was the Russians had put together formidable defenses all along their lines.
Okay.
And the Russians are good at fighting from defense, and that's been the case forever. And the Ukrainians moved forward and just was battering themselves against a brick wall. And it went nowhere. So you see, timing matters, and throwing these in the last 60 days is not going to have much effect. And the administration has not come up with a plan for ending the war or for getting victory on our terms that the Ukrainians would find acceptable and that we would find acceptable for our interests. But this is a very serious business.
Well, and this actually takes me into, I think, the larger context of it. And so in the recent Asia Times article that you wrote about this, you described the Biden administration handing Trump a World War III scenario. And that takes me right into Ukraine's former military commander-in-chief, Valery Zaluzhny, who said that the direct involvement of Russia's autocratic allies in its war on Ukraine means that World War III has started. Followed up by, last week, Vladimir Putin being quoted as saying the war is going global. So I guess my worry is whether or not they're correct. Are we in World War III?
I think we're certainly in a global war. And this is not just a little sort of a fight in Ukraine, but rather it is a fight that is taking place in several different fronts outside of Ukraine. And additionally, it is involving probably 4 or 5 other nations, enemy nations, whose objectives are to, at best, backfoot the Americans, at worst, to dominate and destroy us. And in that sense, it certainly has become a global war. Whether it's World War III or not, one can debate that, but certainly it is a global war by any measure. When you have a country like North Korea, that is sending at least 10,000 troops on top of all of the hardware, the ammunition, the missiles they've already sent. North Korea is getting into this fight in its own right as just a real player. That tells you something. And it also is important to remember that the North Koreans wouldn't do this if the Chinese didn't give them the go-ahead. North Korea depends on China for 95% of its energy, its food, everything. And the Chinese could turn it off anytime they want. So you have to consider that China is going all out to support Russia in this. So you have Russia, China, North Korea, and you have Iran, which is supplying long-range drones in particular to the Russians. And you have even Venezuela, which down in its turf is actually threatening to cause something very serious for the Americans to have to deal with by going after really the western part of Guyana next to Venezuela that's rich in oil. That would be something else you have to deal with. Cuba, Nicaragua. You see these nations that are all aligning with the nasty nations. And by any measure, this is a global effort. But is it World War III? Once again, that's it's probably going to be 10 million words written on it at some point. But I would compare it to, and I really wish I was like 140 years old and had lived through the 1930s, because so much of this would look familiar. One could ask, particularly looking back, but if you'd had the foresight at the time, look at the Spanish Civil War. You had the Italians involved, the Germans, the Russians, and others providing different degrees of support as well. And that clearly was a global war. And it was just a question of how big it was going to get. And could you consider the Spanish Civil War really just to be the opening scene of World War II? I think there's a good case to be made for that. I think we see something similar potentially going on with Ukraine. And one, of course, looks at these things and likes to think, well, it's not a foregone conclusion. It doesn't have to happen this way. Because you look at the 30s and you say, well, if the British, the French had done something different, well, maybe you wouldn't have got the global conflagration that took place. And
Yeah.
same thing now. You have to ask, what is it we should be doing, could be doing, to head off something a whole lot worse than what we see already.
Well, in terms of things that are a whole lot worse, last week Russia launched a new hypersonic ballistic missile into Ukraine. Now, it was armed with conventional explosives, but capable of delivering between 3 and 6 nuclear warheads to independent targets, right? It was a MIRV. Putin also changed Russia's nuclear doctrine to say that any attack by a non-nuclear power supported by a nuclear power would be considered a joint attack. Any attack by one member of a military bloc would be considered an attack by the entire alliance. So it feels like this is taking us pretty close to the edge. I wanted to ask, in your opinion, how close are we to nuclear war right now?
If I knew the answer, I'd tell you who's going to win the Super Bowl this year.
Yeah.
Nobody really knows, and I shouldn't be laughing about it. But one does admire the people who can say with such certainty that we're just inches away from nuclear war. They seem to be mind readers and know exactly what Mr. Putin is thinking. And the way I would look at it is that if you've followed Putin since he came to power, that he often sort of rants and gesticulates and throws out some pretty blood-curdling language. And he said this about nuclear war, the use of nuclear weapons in the past.
Okay.
And one does recall a sort of a German leader in the 30s who would do similar things. You can see the videos on internet. But that said, you do not want to underestimate this or just blow him off as the rantings of a dictator. No, not at all. And I think when he makes these threats that he may not have, I don't think he's decided what he's going to do or even under what circumstances he would. But sometimes as events develop, you find something that would be unthinkable when you say it actually become kind of plausible, or it doesn't seem like that unrealistic or sort of just something you cannot do. And I would suggest that perhaps Mr. Putin looks at this, and I think he is certainly trying to intimidate his opponents. And you look at how well he's done with that. People are pulling their hair out because Putin's threatened to use nuclear weapons. So that kind of works. But also, I think he would consider using them. And I would say what we're talking about here is tactical nuclear weapons, most likely. Not going to be a sort of a great big one launched into New York City. Let's say tactical nuclear weapons, which you could use, say, on the battlefront in Ukraine. And say you could just make 10 miles of the Ukrainian defenses nothing. And you could just go right in, plus just the shock of a weapon like that being used. I think that maybe it's something to consider if he thinks he needs to do it. Thinks it's in his interest, and he thinks he can get away with it. Because these people are generally not suicidal. And I think that Mr. Putin as well, he's amassed a good bit of wealth. And he does, I think likes being the head of Russia. So I think it's a question of, do you need to do it? Can you get away with it? And I don't think he thinks he needs to do it just yet. So I would take it seriously. But at the same time, if you roll over and say we must give him what he wants, well, you just might as well start writing up the terms of our surrender. But that's just the nature of sort of the nuclear threat. And these weapons really are particularly useful when a dictatorship uses them against a country, a democracy, a country with consensual government. They're just very good as weapons of intimidation. If you actually start using them, then they do become almost weapons of suicide, even for the bad guys who throw them around. Isn't quite the ace in the hole that one thinks.
Grant, I want to go back to something you kind of alluded to a moment ago, and this kind of touches on the blurring or softening of the nuclear threat, right? And for me, that seems like it could be as scary or more scary in some ways than this larger overhanging threat of all-out nuclear war. And the reason I say that is, again, Russia launched what was first described as an ICBM. The news backed that down to an IRBM, which was constructed based on an ICBM, right? And so you have this nuclear delivery system, but it's only delivering conventional explosives, right? And a moment ago, you talked about, potentially, should the need arise, Putin could use tactical or small-scale nuclear weapons, right? So again, we're edging into this territory of of nuclear warfare, but if we do it in a soft way, I think that is particularly terrifying because it takes away that blunt edge, right? Of that all or nothing decision where this is going to be the end of the world, right? That's what the nuclear deterrent is designed for right now. It seems like we're blurring that. Do you think that may end up happening?
I would rule it out. Use of tactical nuclear weapons was actually part of Soviet doctrine throughout the Cold War, using them in Europe, for example. And it would upset the battlefield, to put it mildly, and generally to the other side's disadvantage, unless they start throwing them back. So it's not quite as easy as it sounds. But I think we are moving that way, to the point where the idea of using a tactical nuclear weapon either against an actual target or as a demonstration is being considered. I don't think we're there yet, but certainly, it's that we can see the door from where we are, and the Chinese as well have tactical nuclear weapons and a sense to use them, and it very much is, say, for intimidation purposes against a certain type of opponent. And I've could imagine, say, a situation, if one thinks about it, where just for example, say the People's Republic of China were to attack Taiwan, and in the process they set off a tactical nuclear weapon, not on Taiwan but just offshore, and then sent the message to Washington: look, this is domestic matter, you stand clear, or it's World War III, and a nuclear World War III. And you can see that the psychological aspects of using that. And so much of war and what people do is psychological. Not all of it, but a lot of it is. And so that is where tactical nuclear weapons are a real concern, because one side sees that they can be used to help them win, get what they want. And it particularly is the case when the other side doesn't have tactical nuclear weapons. And we have almost none. So your alternative is, instead of matching or using a big enough explosion, but not the biggest possible one, that if you have no option besides the big ones, well, how do you respond to that? And that is a position I think we've put ourselves in over the years, thinking that, well, Cold War ended, we won, there would never be another fight again. And that the other side understands this. And so they've got a range of nuclear weapons that they can employ. But it is in some ways depressing, of course, to think that this is what we're talking about. The way we would, I don't know, we might talk about enforcing fishing regulations on a lake when the fishermen are taking too many big mouth bass out of it. It's something that we're actually talking about as something that could happen, and nonetheless, it's where we are. And to the extent that you display weakness, demonstrate that you can be pushed around. That you're, I think, inviting the other side to think, well, maybe we should use something like this. But when you do the opposite, seems that these sorts of weapons don't get used very much at all. You look at it with poison gas, for example. One reason nobody uses it is because they know they're going to get it in return and can't deal with that. So, for me, I take Putin. Believe me, I take Mr. Putin seriously. But when it comes to these threats, as I say, we've seen him before, and you also have to ask, what is in it for him if he is to use that? And I don't think he's quite ready to do it.
Let me get into China. You are the author of the book, When China Attacks, A Warning to America. I'm going to put a link into the book and in the show notes, the YouTube show notes for this. So I want people to definitely take a look at that. It is an amazing book, and this is really your area of expertise, and it has been for a very long time. So back in October, the Council on Foreign Relations wrote, Russia and China are strengthening their alliance with a notable focus on Ukraine, with China supporting Russia while promoting itself as a peace broker. So one thing I'm wondering is, if Russia gets into a direct conflict with NATO, Do you think that China will take a side in this, or will they try and maintain this kind of pseudo-neutrality that they've had and try and broker peace?
I think they're going to do what they see as in their interests and what will allow them to come out of whatever fight the Russians have with NATO, have China come out better, in a better position. And if that involves giving the Russians a whole lot of support, well, they'll do it. If it involves talking a good game and making it sound like they really, really want to reach an agreement, they'll do that. And that is really China's MO, is to look at it as for what's in it for them. And you'll notice they've done this in the fighting in the Middle East with Gaza, where the Chinese have acted as if they just want to broker a peace, while at the same time they're buying Iranian oil by the boatload. And probably Iran has probably gotten, let's say, $50 billion in oil sales from the Chinese that they use then to buy, or to really to keep their economy afloat, but also to build drones and other weapons that they provide to the Russians, but also the direct support which they give to Hezbollah, to Hamas, and other terrorist groups in the region. So China talks a good game in one sense, and there's people who want to say, oh, look, they want peace, they're a responsible nation. But at the same time, if you look closely at what they're doing what is most beneficial for China. And they have from day one in the fight in Ukraine, they have been providing Russia with a lot of support. And also I mentioned the go-ahead, which they've given the North Koreans to help the Russians as well. And they're backing up the Iranians. So that is how China behaves. It's really not all that hard to figure out. The statements that Xi Jinping made about their no limits partnership, if you remember, just before the Ukraine war started, the Chinese were serious about this, and they were going to give the Russians everything they could. And what was said quietly, it was reported, if one looked at it, was the Chinese said, well, when the time comes for us to settle Taiwan once and for all, we expect the Russians will help us. There really is no sort of good way to characterize what the People's Republic of China intends to do. And the idea that somehow the Russians and the Chinese are just mortal enemies, or they just can't get together like oil and water, that's just wrong. I think and we've got empirical evidence, of course, to demonstrate that they've got, this full-blown support that they've given the Russians as well. And their strategic interests have aligned. And we've seen this before, once again, in the 30s, where the Russians and the Germans, very close military ties, economic ties, throughout the 30s until one day they didn't. But as I said, their strategic interests align, and that's very much anti-West, anti-United States. And the problems that they have, and China does indeed intend to get back this chunk of the Russian Far East that it believes the Russians took from it some centuries ago when China was weak. They intend to get it back. But for now, that can wait, just as the way that China waited a long time to get Hong Kong. They don't mind waiting a good long while if necessary. But they see an opportunity against the West to weaken the West, weaken and distract the United States. And they're taking advantage of it. So if the Russians and NATO do come to heads, I would expect to see China doing everything it can to capitalize on it, and also to benefit at Russia's expense as well. The deals that have been cut with Russia in exchange for Chinese support have generally been ones that favor the Chinese side much better than they do the Russians.
Well, in September, the Secretary of the Air Force, Frank Kendall, said that the Chinese Communist Party continues to invest heavily in capabilities, operational concepts, and organizations that are specifically designed to defeat the United States and our allies' ability to project power in the Western Pacific. And this includes weapons targeting U.S. land and sea assets like air bases and aircraft carriers. So one of the things that I'm kind of wondering is, even though Russia is in the headlines because of nuclear saber rattling, is China actually more of a larger immediate threat to us?
I think so. And Frank Kendall's actually very good. If you want to, one tends to sort of declare all government officials as lazy good-for-nothings, which is obviously not true. But Frank Kendall's a very good secretary. And I think he is right. And I think China is as you've noted, is the main threat for us. It's the one that if they chose their time chose their places, they could probably defeat us. As I say, they'd have to get the timing and the location right. And also, it's not just a military fight that the Chinese are prosecuting. It's one that takes place in a number of other fronts that are non-kinetic, that don't involve use of military force. But before getting to that, the Chinese have built up a military which is intended to defeat the Americans. In fact, after Tiananmen Square in 1989, just after that, the Chinese government gave orders to the People's Liberation Army to be able to defeat a country that has aircraft carriers. Well, guess who that is? And they have put something together that makes it hard. They understand us, they understand our strengths, and they try to neutralize those. For example, aircraft carriers with their some of their long-range missiles that they call carrier killers. The idea is that you can make it just too risky for America's carriers to get in close, say to defend Taiwan or to attack China. Even their missile force is just immense, and we don't have anything comparable. So just about any U.S. base in the Pacific or allies base, the Chinese could rain missiles on those. If they wanted to. Additionally, our other advantages are submarines. That's been our ace in the hole. And the Chinese have really gone all out on anti-submarine warfare and building up their own submarine force to the point where we had better take it very seriously and be worried. Additionally, outer space. You can see our so-called ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities, with our satellite networks where we can see all sorts of things. And also it's important for our command and control and just the way we fight a war. It depends on sort of the internet or computers. And the Chinese have built up their own capabilities in this area, but also their capabilities to blind us, to take out our own resources up in space. So they've looked very carefully at what our strengths are, and they've gone about trying to challenge us in those areas and really blunt our advantages. And then there is just the simple question of sheer numbers. As is widely reported, the Chinese are putting out about 5 warships for every one that we do. And their navy is now much bigger than ours. And people say, well, our capability is so much better. That I wouldn't be sure of that. In fact, it's not. We may have some advantages, but numbers matter. And one example in the South China Sea, where China has effectively had de facto control for about 7 or 8 years. We can go in there, we can sail our ships in, but it's like the olden days before Rudy Giuliani cleaned up Times Square. If you remember when NYPD could send a patrol car through Times Square and all the criminal element would all part, and the patrol car controlled wherever it was, it controlled that. And then it went through and things closed up and you knew who ran the place. But back to what I was saying is that when the U.S. Navy goes in there, the Chinese can put, say, 10 ships on to cover every one that we send in, if they are of a mind to. And I'm not even talking about their maritime militia, which done right could cause us no end of trouble. And so numbers do matter. And we've pretended they don't. We've really had an air of condescension, I think, in much of what we've done over the years is these people will never be our equals. Well, they are. They're as smart as we are, and they have not been standing still. So using a sports analogy, say it's, remember the Dallas Cowboys for all those years reigned supreme, and then Dwight Clark made that catch. The 49ers came along. So another team comes up, and you don't quite see them coming, and then they're past you. And that in some ways is what has happened to us. In addition to our inability to recognize that the Chinese see themselves as having been at actual war with us for 30 years at least, probably 50 is more like it, but use 30. And they have prosecuted in ways that we don't consider warfare. And instead, we focused on the military part of it, the hardware parts of this, and not looked at the other things that they have done to weaken their enemy, is how they would describe it, and also to put us in a position from which we find it very hard to respond. And if we do respond, we may not be able to respond very well. And to the Chinese way of looking at warfare, the so-called kinetic part, which is that's the cool word people use these days for shooting. That's actually the last stage when the Chinese look at it, if it's even necessary. So, we focused on this very last part, while there's this other warfares that have been fought against us that have put us in, I think, a very difficult position. And the Chinese are really, I think, the one country that could defeat us. I would not be as concerned about the Russians at all. But when you combine the Chinese and the Russians, and the North Koreans, the Iranians, the Venezuelans, you can see things have not necessarily developed to our advantage.
Definitely a dangerous position. So back in October, SCSP, their Senior Director for Defense, Justin Lynch, told National Defense Magazine that China has been closely studying how the United States fights wars and has developed a quote-unquote theory of victory to defeat the U.S. military. And so this comes not too long after Xi Jinping was quoted as telling his military leaders to quote unquote prepare for war. So in that case, I don't think he specified any particular rival or conflict, but should there be cause for concern, especially with the tension that is involved in the Russia-Ukraine war, that a military escalation may be coming soon that would involve potentially Russia and China?
I think it would be sort of malfeasance for our leadership not to act with that sense of urgency. That's how bad I see it, unfortunately. And Xi Jinping has given the orders, actually, to be ready to fight a war. But he isn't the first one, actually. Chinese leaders were saying this around the turn of the century, that telling the military to get ready to be able to defend China, defend China's overseas interests. And I think this figure of this 2027, which is thrown out a lot about when Xi Jinping supposedly has told his military to get ready, I think it's actually sooner than that. I would actually say it happened a few years ago. And I think they have been ready for a while now to be able to start a fight if they felt like it. And I do, as I said, take that very seriously. And it's also important to remember that the Chinese refer to the United States as the main enemy. And they have been referring to us as an enemy for a good long while. So the idea that we don't know what they're thinking, I think that's wrong. I would always suggest to people that if you read the English language Chinese press, say China Daily, Xinhua, even Global Times, which would not be saying the things it says if the government didn't want it to. Just read these for a week, and that will give you a pretty good sense of things. Additionally, there's been some good translations of Xi Jinping's speeches that were obviously given in Chinese, and a few of them that wasn't really expected Westerners would see. But he's been very clear that he sees us and our system as the thing that has to be defeated for the Chinese system, the communist system, to prevail. Very clear about it. And it's one of the ironic things is that if you recall when Xi Jinping came on the scene, that the Western press was writing stories about he was a reformer, just secretly, he just had to get his position solidified and then things would be much better. But that was sort of like the press claiming Yuri Andropov, the Soviet leader for a little while. He was actually pro-West because he drank Scotch whiskey and liked listening to jazz. I mean, those were the stories that were written. And we were grasping at straws. But in almost the same day that an article in one of the main U.S. papers came out describing Xi as a reformer, secret reformer, he actually gave a speech that was only later revealed, in which he very clearly laid out, we were the enemy, we were to be destroyed. If the Chinese Communist Party was to continue. So it's not hard to really understand what the Chinese leaders think, but it does just take a little effort. And they do telegraph their punches. James Lilly always used to say that, and it certainly has been my experience as well. They always tell us what they're going to do. And there really shouldn't be any sort of lack of clarity over who their target is. And it is funny, you'll even now hear some very senior U.S. military officers now and then saying, if only they would tell us their intentions. It does make you wonder what the qualifications are for promotion to 4-star whatever, being a little funny. But they're very clear about it, and we should not act surprised. And we should, as I say, it does require us to have some focus and some urgency for the threat that we face as I see it.
Absolutely. Well, Grant, let me thank you so much for your time today and for describing all of the details, I guess, both of what's going on with Russia and China and the potential overlap between those. We're definitely in dangerous times right now. Let me ask, what is coming up for you as we move into 2025? And what do you see coming up in world politics, if you're willing to make any bets at all in the next few months?
Uh, every year I get asked to write something for a periodical in Japan. And last year, my predictions for 2024 was basic. I think the title was, what is it? God, get us out of this one, and I swear we'll be good. Just give us one more chance, I swear. But I think actually I'm less pessimistic than I was, not just a few weeks ago, actually. Looking at it as I saw the situation, you could see that what I would call the bad guys, and these are people who take organs out of live prisoners and murder people they don't like. So I'd call them the bad guys for those reasons, among others. There was nobody that really scared them in the free world. There was no leader that really, they were worried about. And I think that we have the potential for a pretty good change where the free world kind of wakes up and says, these people, they want to get us. We're going to defend ourselves. And that is as much a mental awakening as it is anything else. And I think that we do have a chance now to sort of recognize the threat, the danger, and do something about it, and particularly stopping this self-destructive behavior on our part. Whereas you can't expect you're going to cut a deal with, as I said, regimes that take organs out of live prisoners, or it just isn't going to be done. And so at least you can stop doing that. And you can also stop funding your main enemies. And that is that, I'm referring to that flow of foreign exchange that we pump into the People's Republic of China, that they use to buy Australian iron ore, to build steel, to build their navy. They use it to get their fentanyl factories going and get it to America, where it's killed up towards 1 million Americans over about the last decade. And it all comes from China. And we've got to stop, as I say, funding our main enemy, stop doing things that help this country and other countries that want to destroy us. And then back to Russia, where we started this off, I read a figure just the other day that Europe still buys about 18% of its gas from Russia. So here we have this war in Ukraine while we're buying Russian gas, providing them with convertible currency that they use to fight their war. It really is going to take a clarity of thought and effort. But I think that, we've seen before that what free people can do when they are motivated, often by fear, and usually they recognize it later than they should. But I think we actually do have a pretty good, a much better position, I think, than we did. And we will see how this plays out. So I'd probably use a slightly different title for my predictions this year. But I would say in some ways now it's up to us to see if we can sort of live up to what we were given by the people who came before us. I remember, because I'm of that age when I was born, 10, 11 years after World War II ended. So I remember growing up and the young people thought their parents were all idiots. Well, these were just the people who had won World War II and handed us something pretty good. What have we done with that inheritance? I think so. It'll be up to us now to see how well we do.
Grant, thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
No, pleasure. I always enjoy it. Thank you.